Well, good morning. Thank you everyone for being here on a Saturday. I appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to this. I'll kind of start with some of the logistics here. We're at the Village of Waunakee Community Center. There are restrooms out the door and to the left down the hall. We also have emergency exits noted through that way, as well as through this door. There is an exit door straight to the back patio. What we're going to be doing today is we're going to start here inside where it's nice and comfortable. We originally planned to be outside, but with the number of people here, we can, within the restrictions, we can meet inside, be a little more comfortable. We'll go through a PowerPoint presentation here. We are scheduled for 8 to 11 this morning, so we'll start here. Feel free, if you do need a restroom break or whatever, feel free to walk out. But then when we're done here, we'll take maybe a 15-20 minute break so y'all can stretch your legs and walk or grab your vehicles and head over to the park pavilion where that tree was. We're then going to follow up. We're going to take everything that we learned here, put it into practice, manually put that tree into the ground, and then we'll be done for the morning. Any questions so far? Good. All right, so this is tree planting basics, small investments now, big future benefits. This is a project that was funded in part with a grant from the Wisconsin DNR Urban Forest Grant Program. It was a 50-50 match fund to help communities benefit their urban forests. So, I'm Nathan Schupels. I'm the Consulting Department Manager with Waunakee Tree Signs. I've been in the green industry for about 15 plus years now. I've been with Waunakee for about 11 years now, doing everything from turf management at golf courses starting out, to then getting involved with municipal forestry programs through college, doing a lot of parks maintenance and early tree care. Then my career at Waunakee started in the production end of it, doing tree planting, pruning, removals, plant health care, and then getting involved in the consulting, doing a lot of municipal inventories and management planning has kind of directed my career here. Also very active in the Wisconsin Arborist Association. If any of you do have questions afterwards about finding qualified tree care contractors in this area, I do recommend going to the Wisconsin Arborist Association homepage. There is a feature there, a Find an Arborist, where they do maintain by county practicing arborists meeting a few initial qualifications. So if you do have questions about finding good contractors in your area, I recommend Wisconsin Arborist Association homepage, Find an Arborist. So I know I have my objectives with this class. My objective is to try to impart some of the lessons that I've learned in the field over my career to help get you going in the right direction in regards to planting trees and young tree, those early years of tree care. To get there, we have to understand the why before the what. So we're going to be talking a little bit about how are the trees reacting to some of the management that we're doing, whether it's planting or pruning. That understanding will allow you to make more educated and efficient decisions in the field. And then how to implement proper tree installation techniques by taking a few simple steps to get that tree in the ground and established versus just taking the pot, throwing it in the ground and walking away. A few little preparation steps are going to help that tree establish itself much quicker and be much healthier in the future. So that's what I want to get out of today. I'm curious, you and I were chatting that you're interested in some fruit trees, some knowledge on fruit trees. And nut trees. Do we have, from the other attendees here, do you have anything specifically that you'd like to get out of today?
Well, I'm planning on digging up some small pine trees my father-in-law's 40, and then use them as a border in my yard.
Okay. Okay.
About a month ago, we had this big storm that blew down a tree right by in my front yard, and my wife wants me to put a new tree in there, and I just wanted to know what I need to do, you know, how to do it properly.
Perfect. Well, you came to the right spot. So yeah, we'll go over some of those. I encourage interruptions, questions. I prefer this to be a discussion versus a lecture. I can certainly lecture all day, but I find that everybody gets the most benefit if we kind of go off on tangents, if you have specific questions, or we can dive into the details more so than what I'm presenting here. I find that's helpful. So I welcome questions during the talk. So to start out our tree planting checklist, we need to determine your wants and needs. We need to examine the site and then choose the best plant that serves as a compromise. This concept is pulling away from the mentality of saying, well, I grew up in northern Wisconsin. I grew up around sugar maples, beech trees, and white pines. Now I live in southern Wisconsin, and I want to replicate that planting down here. Very simply, we need to understand that even within our state, we have much different climates and then soil environments. And what you need to, or what I recommend that you do, is drill down to what exactly is it that you'd like to achieve. Do you want really nice fall color? Do you want a border, like you mentioned? Do you want to benefit the wildlife in your area? And then do some digging. Do both literally and figuratively. Try to find out what sort of soil do you have on your property. What sort of sunlight conditions, what sort of moisture content do you have naturally occurring on your property, and what is it within your capacity to supplement with? When you determine what sort of soil you have, what sort of hydration you can provide, or moisture you can provide those plants, what sort of light exposure they're going to have, then you can narrow down that list of tree species that will do well in that environment. If you plant a tree that is going to naturally do well in your environment while still providing those same benefits, you're going to have a much better return on your investment by a tree that's going to grow quickly, establish itself, and be healthy, not requiring additional techniques like plant health care management, such as fertilization or pesticide application, to keep it healthy down the road. Narrow it down to those trees that are going to fit your wants. Say, in the case of fall color, maybe you wanted that fall color, you wanted that sugar maple because it turns that beautiful reds and oranges. Well, on a difficult site, or urban sites as we know them to be compacted and sometimes limited in nutrients and excessive light and diminutive moisture, maybe we plant a tree species that can handle something like that, like a musclewood. Something that might be smaller in stature, fit better in your yard, tolerate some of those more extremes better than, say, a sugar maple can, and still get you the fall color that you want, but have a tree that's going to be better suited to the site. And there's many examples in regards to that, of opening your mind to getting away from the tree species that you exactly want. Find that tree that's best suited to your needs and best suited to the site, to not have to spend as much on management in the future. This is an excellent tree planting diagram that covers just about everything we're going to be speaking about today. It's available from the Arbor Day Foundation. I do recommend, after this course, going back to this. This simple diagram covers it all. Number one, call before you dig. Digger's Hotline. It's very important that we preserve the infrastructure utilities that have been established in our communities and not mess with those. So find out where are those underground utilities. It is a free service. Give them 3 to 5 days. So a little bit of foresight and a little bit of planning ahead of time. Make sure that you are digging where it is safe to be working. And you will see where we're planting this tree outside that it's already been marked. And because it got marked, we did have to move our planned location just to stay safe around those utilities. Handling with care, that's talking about the transport, making sure that our trees stay safe. We'll kind of go through some of those techniques, but it's both preserving the canopy, but also preserving the integrity of the root system. Digging a proper hole. Standard is that we're planting the root flare at soil grade, and then we are digging a hole that's 2 to 3 times the width of the root ball as it's been delivered, and we'll go through what to expect. The planting depth, again, it's the trunk flare that should be at the existing soil grade. That trunk flare is that natural transition from the trunk of a tree down to its rooting system. We see that in the nature in the woods all the time. In urban environments, typically a lot of times trees are planted too deeply. That root flare is planted above ground or below ground, and that leads to a whole slew of problems that we're going to talk about later. Filling the hole, we're backfilling with native materials. Maybe we're adding some natural soil amendments to promote a slow release of additional nutrients and creating a better site for that tree to establish. And then we're mulching. 1 to 2 inches of mulch, maybe a little bit more if you'd like. Very important that we pull the mulch away from the trunk of the tree. We're going to go over all of this outside of the call before you dig in detail. This just captures, this one visual captures essentially the whole presentation. All right, tree planting techniques and planting stock variability. Within nursery, or what you're going to find when you're talking to nurseries or sellers of plant material, we're typically going to be dealing with these 3 types of stock types. Does anybody, or can anybody tell me what these 3 are, starting with this one on the left?
That's bare root.
Correct. So this is bare roots. These are trees that are typically dug out of the fields in the very early or late winter / early spring. It's very important that trees are dug before buds break. Meaning that the buds break and the leaf development starts. So these trees, very dependent on the time of year when you can get them. Also dependent on the species that do well with this type of stock. So that's some of the drawbacks, is you're dealing with a very limited time frame of when you can get this type of stock. And when you do get it, there's some special care that you have to take before you can get it in the ground. Mainly is to keep the root system moist. You accomplish that by taking excess burlap planting material. Typically these are delivered with that burlap material around it. Soak it with a hose once a day. Keep it in a cool, shaded environment until you're ready to put it in the ground. This could be the north side of a garage, outside, or it could be inside of a garage. It's already going to be cool because of the time of the year that you can get this, say, in April. That's taken care of, but it is important to keep it moist and keep it out of direct sunlight. Try to get it in the ground as soon as you can.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask. How long can you keep it?
So if you're going to go with bare root, and the benefits of bare root is that it's typically cheaper because that's less material that the manufacturers are having to handle and deliver to you. And then it's easier for you, it's easier on your body to be planting this bare root stock versus any of the container or some of these other options. So you can save money here. However, it does require some additional care, specialized care, and I work with municipalities a lot. My expectation with bare root stock, the success maybe in the 60 to 70%. So if I'm overseeing a municipal spring planting program and I have 6 or 7 trees that live through the season with the bare root, I'm happy with that. It's kind of a cost. I'm just making decisions. I'm saving money, so I'm willing to lose a few more of these. Okay? So, this middle stock, does anybody know what the term for this is? This is called bulb and burlap. So what you'll see here is this is a tree that's dug out of the field, and then all of the soil in this root system is moved with that tree. So you'll see typically nowadays a wire cage holds the bottom 2/3 of the ball, and then the top third of the ball is attached via twine that's laced back and forth over from the wire cage, crisscrossing back around the trunk to hold this all together. The concept there is, with any tree that we're taking out of the fields, whether it's bare root or ball and burlap, we're removing roughly 90% of the existing root system of that tree. With bare root, we are shaking all of that excess soil off and then moving that tree because it's cheaper to do it that way. Again, narrow time frame. Ball and burlap keeps that existing soil structure around all of the roots. So it makes these trees more hardy. They can withstand some more jostling around. It also opens up the time frame for when they can be dug, when they can be healed in throughout the growing season, and when they can actually be planted. It opens it up to the whole growing season, if not the following growing season. This is very, very heavy. Typically, in a commercial setting, when we're planting trees that are 3-inch caliper, even 2-inch caliper plus, it requires special lifting equipment to move this around.
Is it the four-sided fork that you put down?
Yeah, so to get these out of the field, the nurseries will use a specialized spade piece of equipment that forces hydraulically multiple blades to dig around. They lift that up, and then they have a wire basket with a burlap blanket in there, and they place that directly in that and then package it for delivery. Same piece of equipment used to dig out bare root, or same technique. However, then it's shook to remove the soil. So this stock will also be the most expensive, again, because the specialized equipment, the employee hours to move it around, the shipping costs, as well as installing it in the landscape, the time, effort, and equipment that's required. So most expensive, however, it gives you the most wiggle room. With these trees, if I'm overseeing a municipal management program, I want success at over 90%. I don't want to be losing any of these trees. If I lose any of these trees within that first year, I have a warranty to make sure that they're replaced, to give another one a chance.
Are these bigger trees?
These do tend to be bigger trees. Now, so I mentioned a measurement called caliper. Okay. Caliper is important to understand because it's going to understand just what that measurement is. In arboriculture, in forestry as a whole, we have a standard measurement, diameter at standard height, or DBH. That's the width of the trunk, 4.5 feet above ground level. That's used in traditional forestry for timber sales, timber harvest. We also use that in urban forestry and arboriculture, as a standard rule of thumb for measuring for plant healthcare techniques and removals as well. Caliper is going to be the measure, the width of the stem, depending on the caliper size, either 6 inches above ground. So, the top of the pot here, it's either going to be 6 inches above the top of the pot or 12 inches. For trees that are less than 4-inch caliper, that caliper will be measured 6 inches above the root ball. For trees that are more, and so that'll be like this stem is less than 1 inch. This plant would have been sold by the pot size, not the caliper size. For trees that are more than 4-inch caliper, that measurement's taken at a foot, 12 inches above the root ball. So it's very important to understand where that measurement's being taken, that if you have an order, that you can double check to make sure you're getting what the nursery said they would provide. Allow for some wiggle room of 1/4 to 1/2 inch. So typically, when I'm overseeing contracts, I'm looking, my order is 2 to 2.5 inch caliper. I would open that window, but I would separate that from 3 to 3.5 inch. And there's differences in prices by the caliper price. Again, the root ball, we're dealing with ball and burlap, increases exponentially as we move up through the caliper sizes. So the price will also exponentially rise because of the time to get that tree to that market size and then the time to get it installed in the landscape. All right. So bare root, this is dug straight from the field, soil shook off, it's delivered, or you pick up immediately and get it in the ground immediately. Because of that, because of the small size and the ease of transport and installation tends to be the cheapest. Ball and burlap, dug in the field, the soil is preserved and kept with that root system. Very heavy, tends to be the most expensive, however, gives you the most wiggle room or leeway for getting that tree in the landscape. And on the end here, this is our container grown tree. This is a container grown tree. Concept here, these trees or these plants are typically started in the field in a nursery bed. When they are small, quote unquote, whip size, they'll be pulled from the field and planted in the pot and allowed to grow in that pot for multiple seasons. It even might be transferred from one pot to the next as that tree gets bigger. The concept there is that here I mentioned when we dig these plants out of the field, we're removing 90% of the root system. This is an effort to try to allow that tree to reestablish root systems in the pot before it's delivered to you as a customer. If you have more root system, you have a healthier plant and a better chance that that tree is going to survive the transplant and establish within your site. So this is a good middle of the road option. This is an option that I recommend to a lot of homeowners. This is what I plant at my house because I don't necessarily have the short time window that's needed to get the bare root in the landscape. I also don't necessarily want to go through the hassle on my own of getting a ball and burlap planted in my landscape. Good compromise here that I can typically move this on my own. These are sold by the container size. I think this is probably close to a number 3 container. What we have out in the field later is a number 10. So I know as an individual, that's about as far as I want to go when I'm planting myself. And I recommend a lot between number 5 and number 10 containers. I think a lot of people can handle on their own, both moving that plant, digging the hole, getting it established in the site. It does come with its drawbacks. It's very heat and moisture sensitive. These pots are black, so if they're sitting in the sun, they're going to get hot quicker. That's going to evaporate the moisture in the pot quicker. So we need to keep these plants in shade until you get them in the ground. And it's also very important that you're monitoring moisture levels within the soil here every other day, if not more. Also, it's very important that we inspect the pot to determine root health. Buy these plants growing in a pot, that there is an increased opportunity for what we call circling or girdling roots. That's essentially where the roots grow out from the stem, they hit the side of the pail and start circling around. That's not good for the future life of the tree, in that it will, as that trunk grows in diameter, those roots are also growing in diameter, and at some point they're going to come in contact with each other. Tree trunk tissue is different than tree root tissue. They will not graft. What they will do is they will conflict and compress against each other, making it difficult for that tree to establish, transport water and nutrients. Essentially, you could expect to cut the life expectancy of that tree by up to 1/2. So if I planted a tree that I planned to be in the landscape for 80 years, maybe I'm only getting 40 to 50 years, just because of that one condition. Major difference between tree planting techniques and the stock type. Here's a visual representation of what it takes to get this different type of stock material in the ground. Here on the left, we have a lot of container plants. A lot of this can be handled by hand. A few simple tools such as a shovel, maybe a spade, some cutting materials, and you're good to go. Ball and burlap trees, you can see a representation of how big these root balls can be, and some of the specialized equipment that's required to move them around the site. You know, this is multiple hundreds of pounds, and that's difficult for one person to move on their own, if not impossible. And here's a good representation of the circling roots that I'm talking about. So here we have a tree stem that's simply too large. That would be the visual cue that it's too large for the pot that it was growing in. That tree stem indicates that that tree was in the pot for a very long time, you know, that it grew to that large. So there was a good chance that what we have here are these circling roots that now essentially this plant has become root bound. So this, you can get this plant in the landscape, good chance it'll look good for a few years, but then eventually these roots will choke out that trunk stem and that tree will be declining for the rest of its life.
So the roots won't redirect at all on that circle?
There will be new roots that will redirect, but the roots that are already on this path will always stay on that path. And then it'll be lateral roots off of these circling roots that will go straight out. But these roots on their own have now created a barrier that will always be there. So there are different things that we can do to correct this issue. Number one is inspecting the quality. Okay? Inspecting the quality of the plant, you know, looking at the plant as a whole, and then when we pull this plant out of the pot, scoring the sides to sever these roots. Sometimes it's so established to have these roots circling that we even need to shave down the sides of the container rooting mass and create somewhat of a square where those significant cuts are required, because if I pulled something out and it's just a solid line of circling roots here on the edge, I can score that and cut that. There's a good chance those roots are going to redevelop in that same circling pattern, as well as going straight out laterally away. So we're going to go through that in the field, kind of show you what to do. But it's very important when you're in the yard to kind of be comparing the size of the trunk to the pot. If I have a trunk here that's roughly 1/3 the diameter of the pot, I know this is no good. Here, you know, the trunk diameter is maybe, you know, 10% the diameter of the pot. This should be good. But you also want to be looking at other cues to tell you, is this a healthy tree or not? Certain cues that you can be looking for after this class when you're out looking for trees on your own. Number one, we typically want a nice tree that's straight up and down. Asterisk or note here, there are some types of tree species like this. This is a dwarf peach, but a lot of your fruit trees and dwarf trees have been developed. They've been selected for what's described as a decurrent growth pattern. So it's supposed to have a lot of a kind of a spreading form versus a vertical, upright, single stem form. We have a tulip tree that's out there, and we'll talk about that. That promotes that. That's a tree that on its own goes straight up, has good branch spacing and a single trunk. This tree on its own will more so be this spreading shrub type of tree. So it's important to kind of look for that. Understand that. So if I had a tree species that I knew was supposed to be straight up and down, some of those examples would be maple species, oak species, maples, oaks, ginkgo, tulip tree. Those are trees that typically will have a straight trunk. Our decurrent, the spreading, are your fruit trees, honey locusts, Kentucky coffee trees. That's good representation. So those are some of the things to keep in mind to say, does this tree have good form or not? Is it doing what it's supposed to? Then I'm looking at existing pruning wounds. If I have a tree, if this tree was supposed to be representative of a straight up and down tree, I would be concerned about the quality. Here we have a cut here where the main stem was actually removed, and a lateral branch is now being promoted as the main trunk of the tree. And then I have all these branches that are going every which way that I would be concerned to say, this tree is going to be a pain its entire life trying to train into one single stem tree. It's just not going to happen. If there's the presence of a lot of deadwood within the tree, or if I have a lot of dead head cuts, so dead head cuts being stubs that are left that indicated a dead branch that was snipped off. If there's a good number of those in relation to the overall canopy, I become concerned. And I brought this tree in specifically to kind of serve as an example of what to look for to kind of key you in. I've taken off all marketing materials to say where this came from. I don't want to rag on any supplier. I just want to provide you that opportunity that this is the time of year where you can get a lot of plant stock at extreme savings, whether it's 50% off, even 75% off. But if you don't know what you're looking for, you can be buying a lot of junk, okay? So keep that in mind. Here, what I have is I have a lot of pruning cuts right at the base. A lot of fruit trees are grafted. So we have a standard root stock. It's a species that's typically very easy to grow and establish and grow in large numbers. And then those root systems are harvested, snipped off, and then a scion of a tree species that shows whatever characteristic that it wants or that the consumer wants is grafted onto the root system. Welcome.
Oh, wrong class.
But then some of the problems that we sometimes get is that original root system or mother root system wants to keep sprouting off of the base. If there's somewhat of an imbalance in the chemical structure of the tree, this should be naturally inhibited, just due to how this is, how it's been created. If I see a lot of cuts like I am seeing down here, again, this is telling me this is something that might be a pain for the rest of this tree's life and have to continually be maintained and managed. So something that's not that great.
So you'll just have to keep on just trimming it through the life of its tree? Will it like start growing?
That's correct. You'll see the flush of growth in the early summer.
Yeah.
Take a hand pruner and prune it off, as low as you can without damaging the trunk of the tree that you're trying to grow. The hope is that eventually, as this tree establishes and you get a better canopy and a more established trunk, that overcomes this chemical imbalance that's allowing this, that the natural chemical hormone highways that we have here take over this spot and then start inhibiting any continued sprouts. But you might have to manage that for a good number of years before that tree naturally overcomes that.
So when you were talking about the spiros, how do you tell in a pot that it is spiral if it isn't, coming out just by the diameter of the tree to the pot? Is that
diameter of the tree to the pot is a good one. If the tree stem looks like a stick stuck in the pot, if there's no existing root flare, that's a good indication that there's the presence of circling roots or girdling roots, but at that age they won't have established. So it's at that point, like this, at this point, this is something that you can't overcome. And that would be indicative really of the tree stem size to the size of the pot.
okay?
A lot of container grown trees will look like a stick stuck in the soil because over time soil gets kind of put on and kind of accumulates and buries that root flare. What's important is that before we plant this, we're not planting this at the height of the container. We have to do some detective work. We have to dig down. I have to dig down and find where is the root flare of this tree, and then that's going to tell me, say if this is buried an inch deep, I need to plant this tree at this height. Then we'll put this in the ground, and then we'll shave off the top, and we're going to sever some of those circling roots as we find them. And I did, I brought this in for a staff training earlier this week, and as I was digging down here, I can already feel and find some of those fibrous, very minute circling roots. And those are the roots that, at this age, with my fingers, I can snap, and separate. And then when we leave that area exposed, and we have that tree planted where the root flare is at the soil grade, that constant oxygen, air exposure, sunlight exposure, that's going to stop any circling roots from developing again above the root flare. And that's very important, is that circling roots above the root flare, that's the issue. When it's root on trunk stem contact. If we have the trunk flare exposed and up above ground level, it doesn't really matter. Well, this is still bad, this would be bad, but the tree's going to do much better, and we can have roots that are circling around underneath the ground level, because at that point then it becomes root on root contact that can graft and become a new system unto itself. It's the circling roots that are above the root flare that we need to separate and correct. And I'll kind of show you how to do that in the field. So that's some of the things to think about. Other indicators, that these plants might be root bound. Something that looks like it's been sitting out on the yard for 3 years. Pretty sun bleached pot. Or beginning of the season, marked off on a super sale because it sat in the yard all the previous season. They want to get it out of there. So some things to consider. And that's a good question, because I can't imagine a lot of places are going to be letting you, be on your hands and knees digging in their pots. So those are some of the. I'd say try to find a plant that is either swelling at the base or starting to see that root flare right at the top of the container. So that's the container issue. We have this same issue with ball and burlap. The only one where we don't really have this issue is with bare root trees, because they're dug out of the ground, all the soil's knocked off, you can see exactly where the roots are, and then plant that flare right at soil grade. So it's these containerized options where that flare is invisible, or it's hidden, that we need to take some time. Here we have a balled and burlap tree where the top, this finger here is where the top of the root ball is. After excavation of approximately 6 to 8 inches, we can finally see down here, not so much on this side, but on this side, essentially coming straight at the camera, is where this root flare exists. This is a common theme, and it's not, it's not a knock on any contractor or other industry. It's just calling it for what it is that in the practice to get these trees packaged, to withstand a lot of the damage or the extreme environments that they're going to encounter, in digging these out, there's a high likelihood or a good chance that soil gets pushed on top of the root flare. A lot of these trees are planted at good depth out in the fields, but then as they're dug with that equipment, there's a lot of soil. It's a messy process, and it's very common that soil then gets pushed on top of the root ball, and then it's all packaged together. So another example where it's important, when we're going to be talking about prepping your site and the depth of your hole, that you're not measuring the height of the root ball or the height of the container to determine your depth. It's before you even do that, you dig into the container or you dig into the ball of burlap. You can cut into that burlap and start poking around with a small trowel or a hook or a knife, a garden knife, to try to determine, here's the top of the root ball, where exactly is that root flare? And when you determine that depth, which a lot of times, or very frequently, is actually at the top of the wire cage, which is a few inches below, the top of the root ball, then you're planning to plant the tree at that level, put the tree in the hole, pull the planting material back, and start shaving that excess soil off the top. Let it sit in the hole like that. So, very important that we're doing plant health inspections as we're selecting our stock and getting the site ready. Some of the other things to look at, we're looking for good full canopy, good leaf color. We're checking for the presence of any sort of disease. In the absence of leaves and canopy, which could be your very early spring stock, or very, very late fall, now that it's going into dormancy, it's losing a lot of leaves and preparing itself for winter. We're looking for the number of and spacing of living buds. Living buds are easy to tell on any tree species in that they will be the most vibrant in color. They'll be swollen even somewhat. So they will look a different color, whether it's, in this case, it's white. It could be a very vibrant purple, very vibrant reds, to say I am a living bud, versus dead buds are very dark and shriveled. So you can see where is living, where is dead. Those living buds, that's where branches are going to be growing for the next season. So in the case of this tree, even though I'm not, some of the things I don't like, I do see a lot of plump, vibrant living buds. So I know if we take some care, get this in the ground, give it some love and attention, next season it's going to be doing pretty good. Some simple steps we can do now to correct what I don't like about the tree, and have a very nice tree going into the future. So, site prep. Use the tools and techniques that you have at hand. Simple concept or our standards is that we're going to be planting our tree where the root flare is either level or slightly above existing soil grade. And then the planting hole that we're making is 2 to 3 times the width of the root system, or the rooting ball, as the tree is delivered. So in the case here, we have an individual, not having a whole lot of specialized equipment, just using the stuff that he has on hand. He's going to measure and mark his dimensions on the soil, or on the shovel, and then use that to guide the direction. How big does the hole have to be? So here we can see the root ball, per his measurement, is roughly half of the width of the planting site that we've prepared. This is adequate. You can make it bigger, but you can see just how big this root ball has to be. Now in this case, the entire site has been dug out to the depth that it needs to be. Same process would be used for the depth. With the tree on its side, take the shovel, lay it, line it up with the bottom of the root ball to the root flare, hold that, put that in the planting hole to determine the depth. We're going to do that out in the field, show you just what that looks like. So what I mentioned was this entire bowl or shallow dish has been excavated. Pro tip: have some sort of impermeable material, such as a tarp, or I have a piece of plywood that's out there, to hold all the soil, sod that you're going to be digging out. Makes cleanup worlds easier. But anyway, so they've excavated this hole. If you're doing a lot of trees, another way that you can get to this is, the concept here is we're breaking all this soil up, we're reducing compaction, and as we backfill, we're creating the environment that benefits root growth by having a good balance of soil aggregate, pores within the soil, and then oxygen and water. And that can be accomplished by digging a hole that's big enough to get your container, the container or the ball and burlap into the hole with enough space to, say, tamp it down with a foot. And then we can backfill with the shovel. We can take the sod off, and this is what I'm going to demonstrate out in the field, but we take the sod off, and then we use the shovel to just break this up. Instead of actually physically digging it all up, throwing it on a tarp, and then putting it all back, instead of having to move all that soil twice, we could still widen the hole, use the shovel to break it up without actually having to take the soil out of the hole. Yes?
I might be jumping ahead of you at this point, but I'll dig my holes bigger in the future on your place. But then also, unless you tell me otherwise, I would have a little pile of peat moss and a little pile of some sort of fertilizer product.
Yeah.
Because if I get down at that depth in this soil, it looks like poverty to me.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, do I make a slurry of peat moss plus some sort of fertilizer to stir into that hole right at the stage here?
So that's going to be the backfill. But yeah, no, excellent question. The question for the camera, I don't know how well I fixed that up, is, are we also then with this backfill going to be mixing in some sort of soil amendment or fertilizer? To fertilizer, manufactured fertilizer, I say no, because that can promote excessive canopy growth. We don't want to promote excess canopy growth in those early years of a tree's life in a new landscape. We want that tree focused on root development. So the soil amendment that I would recommend is compost, whether it be peat moss. I came across a mushroom compost that did very well on a few trees, because that was what was at the garden center at the time. But some organic compost mixed in with the top couple inches of soil as we're backfilling is going to do that tree a world of good. It's these natural compounds that are slowly released that the tree will use to develop a solid foundation of a root system that will then promote, you'll see that canopy growth after that tree is established. Whereas synthetic fertilizers can push that tree to create new canopy growth, further stressing it down the line. A rule of thumb for establishment. That tree will need approximately 1 growing season for every inch caliper. So a tree of this stature, I put this in the ground this fall. Next season, 2021, it will be in establishment or transplant shop. You know, that it's not going to be putting on a lot of growth in the canopy. It's going to be focused on putting root growth and establishing root growth. Then in 2022, it might still be establishing, but I'll see a little more canopy growth. By 2023, that growing season is then where I'm expecting to see an explosion in the canopy. I recommend planting smaller trees because one, they're easier, they're cheaper, and they're easier to put in the landscape. They don't give you the instant gratification of the larger balled and burlap material. However, in studies, like scientific research shows this, that those smaller trees will establish sooner than the balled and burlap under that concept of needing 1 season of growth for every caliper of inch. And in 5 to 10 years, both those trees are going to look the same. Okay, they're going to be the same size. As long as they're cared for adequately, they'll be roughly the same size then going into the future. So if you can wait a little bit, I recommend going with these smaller trees in these number 5, number 10 containers versus dropping, you know, the investment in balled and burlap material. But there are other options where that balled and burlap that's the best option for a reason.
So when you were talking about going back to that peat moss, you would mix that with the soil that you have on your tarp? You would mix all that together?
Not all of it.
Okay.
I'll be working on backfilling when we have our plant in the hole, and this will be a couple slides in. But I'll use this soil to backfill about 2/3 of the way up the side, you know, the side of the root ball, and then the soil that's left at that point is for that top third. That's what I'm going to mix, you know, some sort of a natural compost with. Fill that up to the top, the existing soil grade, and then I might even do another top dressing, so you have a 1/2 inch or something like that.
So to get that root flare, let's say you dig it too deep, you would put soil on the bottom, then put the tree in there?
Yep. So I grew up, my dad's a carpenter. So we got hammered into us our whole lives, the measure twice, cut once thought. Same rule applies here. Measure twice, measure 3 times before you get the final depth of your hole. And on the site that I've prepped, I dug, you know, maybe 2/3, but I haven't gone below that, knowing I really want to get this right. Because you can go too deep, and in practice, I went too deep, you know, many times. Backfill and try to compact the living heck out of that. Because if you plant, there's still, and it doesn't really matter how much you try to stomp on it, it can still compact and settle out over time. So if you plant a tree where the root flare is right at soil level, and you've dug too deep and you backfill, good chance, you know, that could settle out 1 inch. And now that root flare is 1 inch too deep. That's where I I always defer to planting a little high, you know, maybe just above soil grade, knowing that whether it's the planting material or the soil, you know, the hole that we prepped, that can settle out over time. And then eventually that root flare will settle down right to the level that I want it at. I have no problem with a mounded, you know, a mounded planting, because I know there's less risk that I'm dealing with, less challenges that I'm dealing with a mounded planting site that I can always cover with mulch, than trying to get it perfectly level, so to speak, and then having turf come all the way. You know, with the thought being I want it perfectly level all the way up to the trunk of the tree so I can have a nice level lawn. Well, I don't want turf underneath the canopy of that tree anyways, so I'll mulch on top of it so if it's slightly mounded, and that's just my personal preference. Okay. This is, once we have our hole dug, and this is kind of playing into the discussion that we've had here, we're doing a final inspection and starting to shave off excess soil where this tree is right next to the hole. We're not going to be moving it very much. You could even, you need to know where that root flare is to know how deep. So once you have it, what you can see here is he's pulling excess soil off the top, but all of the planting material has remained in place. That existing twine that is scaffolding and holding all of this together, that's not being touched right now. Because at some point this root ball has to go into the hole, so we want to leave all that intact. It's very important we leave all this intact to not compromise that root system. If we take this balled and burlap material and we start pulling things off, or we get it in the hole and we notice that there's all these fissures through the soil, what that's done is that's separated a lot of the microscopic root hairs that we can't see. All of that microscopic root hair, a lot of that is what's doing, you know, that back-breaking work of absorbing nutrients and water. It's not the very large roots that are as thick as our arms. Those are providing the structural stability. It's all this very, very fine rooting material that we need to preserve. And if we have a root, whether it's balled and burlap or container, where we've removed a lot of that soil, we've removed a lot of that root material. That goes back to the bare root stock, why I accept more tree loss out of that. We've removed not only the 90% of root material that the natural root system was when it got dug out, but then in shaking all that soil off, we've removed even a greater amount of that microscopic root, that fine rooting system. So that's where I look at bare root stock. Yeah. If I get 6 or 7 out of 10, we're doing a good job, kind of deal. Now at this point, we want to talk about removing planting materials. Number one important, or the greatest important thing when deciding whether or not to remove planting materials is to preserve the integrity of that root ball, whether that's balled and burlap container. This container has to come off, no matter what. This creates a barrier that the roots cannot penetrate. The burlap will hopefully degrade over time, so the roots can penetrate that. The wire, where we thought, or where I thought, a lot of times wire would create this restrictive presence that a root couldn't grow around. The more and more I did root crown excavation, so using compressed air to blow away soil to make corrections on conflicting root systems, I found that the roots would envelop these wires. Just as if anybody's spent any time on older farms or older farm properties, you walk the old property lines that were traditionally barbed wire fence, you can see where these trees envelop barbed wire. I've seen them envelop whole wire fences that separate urban yards. The most extreme example, I was on a property where a root or a tree sprout grew up through the rusted floorboard of an old Model T and enveloped the steering column. That tree looked perfectly fine. So to think, I no longer have as many concerns around the wire cage system. And as for burlap, you do need to confirm that the burlap is biodegradable. It should degrade over time. But there have also been times where, a tree's been in the landscape for 30 years, you pull it out of the hole, it died, it gets pulled out of the hole, and the burlap is still there. That's not necessarily to say that the burlap wasn't biodegradable. It could be that the soil environment is so poor and such a desert, devoid of any microbial activity, that it didn't break that burlap down. And if there wasn't that to break that burlap down, that tree didn't stand a chance. So that goes back to the site assessment of determining what type of soil do you have and what's the soil health. There are opportunities here within the state between our diagnostic labs or private contractors to have somebody take a look at the soil on your site, determine what plant species will do the best there. So what we're looking at here is, in this case, contractors made the choice to start removing the wire basket. So what they're doing here is, before this goes in the hole, they're removing the bottom ring, kind of the bottom of the basket. That's not doing any damage or really holding anything in at this point, because then this is just going to get rolled into the hole. So the technique for placing trees in the hole, number one rule of thumb here is that we're not physically maneuvering the tree by the trunk stem. This photo is showing an example of two individuals. The individual on the right who has the hands on the root ball, he's the power man. All of the force is being exerted on this root ball because it has a lot greater structural integrity. The man on the left, he's the guide. He's simply applying gentle pressure on the trunk to guide this tree on a path into the hole. It's very important that we're not reefing on the trunk stem, causing separation of roots from soil. We're doing a lot of damage by doing that. And I always keep this slide in there because what's happening here, exactly what I just said not to do. We're pushing, the contractor's pushing on the trunk of the stem to guide it in a certain way. Nowadays, I would recommend this individual be sitting on the ground with planting hooks on either side. Again, maneuvering the root ball. What they're trying to do here is probably to get this nice straight up and down to be aesthetically pleasing. So, once we get the tree in the final resting place, we've determined, all right, this tree is going to be here. We're not touching it anymore. It's at this point that you can remove any planting material that you want. At a minimum, I feel that what needs to be removed with container trees, the whole container has to be removed, all that plastic material. Ball and burlap, it's a very good idea, or what has to be removed at a minimum is the twine lacing that holds the top of the root ball together. What that was doing, that was holding the root ball in the basket. Now you're not moving it anymore. Remove that twine, because that twine is crisscrossing against the base of the tree trunk. That will girdle that tree in the future. And I have seen this and tried to correct it.
You have to say that again, because I was just going to wonder whether the bark of the tree is strong enough to burst the twine.
It is not.
Amazing.
So it might claim that this stuff is biodegradable, but a lot of times, I've seen this exposed just directly to sunlight, and it's not. It needs that moisture, that microbial activity to break this down. And I have seen many times where this twine has girdled the tree trunk. So it's a barrier. Over time, could it break down, possibly separate it? maybe we're talking years.
Thank you.
That's a minute with a utility knife to cut that, take it off, remove that barrier. So then from this point, what I would recommend, cut the burlap off the top of the root ball. If you want, you're good there. If you do want, you feel like tackling it, you see here he has a bolt cutters. They're going to use that to cut the remainder of the wire basket. So it's at this point we're not moving the root ball anymore. So now they're removing that supporting material, knowing that we're not going to try to influence this anymore.
So with the pot though, would you take it out of the pot before you put it in the ground, or do you put the pot in there and then remove the pot?
We're going to remove the pot before the tree goes in the ground.
Okay.
So in this case, we want to disturb this because of the opportunity or the likelihood that there are circling roots in this pot. We want to mix that up. I'm going to have a knife out there that I'm going to be scoring the sides, separating what I can determine are circling roots.
Okay, but a small tree like this, let's say it's circling roots, is it a better chance of it not circling? In the course of the tree?
So the chance is the same that there's circling roots here, but when it's smaller like this, those roots are very fine. So, when we take this out, like I mentioned, I was digging down to find the root flare. I found a couple very fibrous roots that were circling, and I just pulled it with my pinky and severed it.
Okay.
So that's what we're doing here. We still want to create some sort of a disturbance on those roots that are that small, because it's roots that are that small that establish and then become bigger roots. So disturb it now, correct the issue now, avoid it in the future. So then they're going to start backfilling. Now, a good technique for backfilling is to, for that bottom, you can tamp that pretty hard, the very, very bottom of the layer to set that tree in place, give it a good solid foundation. But then as we're backfilling the remainder of the height of the root ball, and just using your body weight to kind of just gently rock back and forth, a foot in the hole and a foot outside of the hole in a circular pattern around that planting site, that's really all that's needed. You don't want to compact it to the point of creating like a new concrete planting bowl. We talked earlier about clay contents, in the soil around here. If we're putting a lot of compaction, clay is going to compact very, very tightly and create an environment that's not beneficial for roots. We also want to water, and in the case here, we have a pretty large tree that's being planted. Instead of backfilling this all the way and then mulching on top and then watering, they're going to be putting some water down into the bottom to immediately get some moisture to some of the deeper roots. The majority of roots of a tree in an urban environment are going to be in the top 12 to 18 inches of soil. Occasionally there will be a taproot that extends deeper down, maybe down to 3 feet. But we do want to focus a lot of our attention in the top foot. But here, when we get to that last, say 12 to 18 inches, that's when we're going to start watering. Get some moisture to those roots that are towards the bottom of the root ball, and then complete our back. And we're not creating a moat, okay? That's very important. We're not creating a moat of water, we're just kind of dampening that lower soil, completing backfill, getting mulch, and then getting a thorough dampening of that water, or dampening of the soil system. All right, tree planting techniques, backfill and soil amendments. This goes back to what we were talking about. It's at this point, the backfill that's been done, it's been about 2/3 of the way, or a half to 2/3 of the way up the root ball. Now it's at this point we're going to mix those organic compounds, whether it's compost or your choice. I would recommend, you know, avoiding, so to speak, synthetic fertilizers. What we have here is mycorrhiza. Yes.
So again, if there's clay, does it have your, do you add sand to it? Is there anything you want to?
I would be adding, and I don't have, you know, to add some sand isn't a bad idea. Adding good topsoil, you know, mixing some topsoil in. You know, so here what we have, and I'll be able to point out, is there's a good layer of topsoil, a couple inches of topsoil, and then below that's clay, and then below that is sand. When I dug the hole and I had that mound of soil sitting right next to it, I just took the shovel and I mixed it all together. And I broke up the clay aggregate and then forced that sand and that topsoil to kind of create this mix that has a better total mix of, or collection of that aggregate porosity, things like that. Mycorrhiza is a naturally occurring organism that has a symbiotic relationship to root systems. So the thought here is that certain compounds like mycorrhiza that you can buy at the store, or mycorrhizae, compost tea, some of those things, it's promoting, it's creating this slurry of microbial activity. The more that research looks into this, the more that it's coming to an acknowledgement that if there's mycorrhiza, you know, that adding mycorrhiza at this point is more of a feel-good action. Most likely, you have your native mycorrhiza that's already existing in the soil that you dug to create the hole. And just by using that native soil as your backfill, using it all or as much as you can, you're just putting that native mycorrhiza back where you just took it from, and it's reestablishing itself with the new root systems. So it's still widely used, but my recommendation is use the backfill that you dug to prepare the hole. Use at the end, mix in and top dress organic compost, and then add a good layer of mulch. Speaking of mulch, at what's adequate, 2 to 4 inches, what are we trying to accomplish, or how is mulch benefiting these trees? Think of mulch as a nice fluffy comforter. It is regulating soil temperature, so it's protecting against the extreme heat of summer and the extreme cold of winter. It helps to retain moisture, so as you water this tree, it serves as a protective barrier, again, against heat and wind, to reduce evaporation. And then over time, it breaks down, creating an organic material, a naturally occurring slow release fertilizer. It's our best shot at replicating what we find in a natural forested environment. You go for a walk in the woods in the fall, all the leaves fall, that creates this very nutrient-rich layer of organic matter that then feeds those trees and feeds a lot of other organisms.
So would you mulch, is it 2 to 4 inches above the root flare then?
Thick.
Oh.
So mulch layer that's 2 to 4 inches thick.
Okay.
And then width is up to you. I'd say at a minimum, draw a lot, you know, a minimum is over your planting hole that you just created, or, you know, to the edges of the tree canopy, you know, as it's first planted. Now, personally, the other thing that mulch is doing is it's keeping mowers away from the trunk of the tree. Okay, whether it's spring trimmers, which I was guilty of doing all the time as a teenager, or park mowers, tires coming up against the base of the tree trunk. We don't want that because it's compacting the soil and it's rubbing the bark. So we want to keep mowers away from the base of the tree. When we lay this 2 to 4 inch thick layer of mulch, we then brush it away from the base of the tree trunk. We want to keep that root flare exposed to the air.
Okay.
If we mulch right up against the trunk of the tree, or even do like a volcano mulch, coming up 10, 12 inches. For all the good things that the mulch is doing to the exterior root system, it can be doing the same thing up against the trunk, creating a dark, moist environment that could benefit fungal growth. And over time, it'll break down into organic material. Tree could recognize that. There are latent buds underneath the bark that a tree could say, hey, I've got this great organic material coming up my trunk. I'm going to create new root systems. And these called adventitious roots will erupt from the tree trunk. They can start circling the tree trunk. So all the good that you did could be negated by poor mulching technique. So when you're done, when you throw the mulch down, take 30 seconds, just brush it away from the root flare and leave that exposed. I'm a proponent of mega mulch rings. For what we talked about, this is our best shot of replicating the natural environment. All of the nutrients that you see from that leaf litter, we don't have that in an urban environment. Typically, we have turf. So if we extend this mulch ring, to twice the width of the canopy, over time, that mulch is breaking down. It's through natural decomposition, it's starting to reduce the compaction of the soil underneath. It's starting to move down that soil profile, creating an environment that's rich in nutrients, less compacted, has a better balance of water, air, nutrients, soil porosity. So this is standard, keeping the mulch ring right over the planting hole or at the edges, the canopy drip line. I would like you to be seriously thinking about, how do you feel about the look of your yard and the health of your trees and doing these mega mulch rings? Okay?
You like those? You like those?
I do.
Okay.
And I was introduced to it, a city that I worked for as a student, and that park manager was a proponent of mega mulch rings, where we would connect individual trees, groupings of individual trees as one giant mulch bed to replicate, these individualized forests within a park setting. They had excessive wood residue to handle due to the removal of ash trees, and just their other removal operations. So they had to have a place for the mulch. To make it available to residents at a dump yard is great, but they're not pulling all of that material, so it's got to be spread somewhere. And then 2, the mowers. It kept the mowers away from the bases of the trees and started seeing better tree health and less damage. It's not a cultural norm. It looks different. So, watering, a nice slow trickle. If you have a soaker hose, I think that's the best way to go about it. Turn it on, say, for a half an hour in the morning. We want to make sure that the tree gets about 1 inch of water a week, whether that's naturally supplemented through rain, and you can monitor that with a grain gauge in the lawn or in the mulch bed right next to the tree to see exactly what is that tree getting. If you do have to supplement, find out if you have to supplement by doing the finger check. Dig into the soil around that tree. If it is cool and moist, or cool and damp, that's good. If it is soggy and muck, it's getting too much water. And if it is dusty and hot and dry, it's not getting nearly enough water. And that can change within 10 feet of a single site. And I just looked at that type of a case about 6 weeks ago, where there was a site where drainage had been changed. And just 4 inches of variation in the site was the difference on a row of maples, where we had a row of 10 maples, and individuals would be looking not as good as their neighbors were. 3 of the 10 were on the verge of dying. We could found that just a variance of 4 inches in the soil grade was the difference between all the trees that were healthy getting natural irrigation from the original drainage system, and then these other 3 that had been lifted up and weren't getting any water at all. So it's very important to check all the trees and not assume that your entire site's the same. All right, staking, a couple concepts here. Stake if needed. Do a test. Once this tree is in the ground, now you can apply some pressure to the tree trunk. If, and I do this, I'm the tree, if I'm wobbling and just my feet are moving, that's natural, that's okay. If I'm wobbling and the floor is lifting to a foot either side of where I'm at, that tree might not be stable in the planting site. So we want to put stakes here on either side, anywhere from 1 to 3 stakes, kind of depends on the size of the tree and the conditions of the site. If you're up on a hilltop that's getting blasted by wind every day, you might need to do 3 stakes. If it's somebody's backyard protected, smaller tree, probably get by with 1 stake. It's just important that we put our stakes outside of the planting bulb. We just did a whole bunch of mess here. We broke up a bunch of soil. We want to make sure that these stakes are structurally stable. Put them outside of where you were just digging, okay? And then the straps or whatever material that you're using. Here we're using a rigid wire and then a nylon strap so we don't have wire on trunk. I have seen wire and then excess garden hose that's been cut. I think that's acceptable. So the wire is fed through the garden hose, and the garden hose is what comes into contact. We're just looking to avoid that sharp wire edge on the tree trunk. And we just want a little bit of pressure here. We want the tree to move. We don't want it to tip over. That natural movement, trees cannot get away from things that are threatening their health. They just can't pick up and walk away. It's their mechanism to outgrow whatever's attacking to them. The same concept as the tree moves in the wind and is doing the tree dance, that movement is spurring additional growth down at the tree base to strengthen that area of movement. That's where we see that natural development of a root flare. That's to a stronger structural foundation to prevent failure. So in these early years, we still want this tree to move. We just don't want it to tip over. Trees should be established enough after 1 growing season in the majority of cases to be able to remove stakes. So 90% of the time, remove the stakes after 1 season. If that tree, say with the root ball, and I have had this happen where I had to take like 10 inches of soil off the top of a 24-inch tall root ball, that was a lot to remove. I kept those stakes on for 2 seasons. They're very, very rare should you ever leave stakes on for more than 2 growing seasons. So, any questions on the planting techniques that we've covered so far?
With the mulch,
Good.
like you say with the ash borer, you can pick up the free mulch from these municipal sites. If you pick it up where they put the ash borer chips, is that going to affect your tree at all?
So the question is, can you take chips from trees that have died due to emerald ash borer? Or will that, you know, hurt the health of the trees in your landscape? The presence of a pest like the emerald ash borer is so widespread and established in our area that pulling chips from that type of pest isn't going to impact the health of your trees, because your trees will already have been impacted by other existing beetles. So in the case of emerald ash borer, in this area, if you haven't treated a tree, it's either dead or dying. It's one or the other. And even with treated trees, you know, there is no 100% effective treatment, so there are treated trees that are dying. The movement of that material down here isn't going to change anything. The movement of that mulch material from an area of known infestation to an area of where it hasn't been detected can be a problem. And that is where, if you do monitor confirmed identifications of emerald ash borer throughout the state, it's made large jumps from southern Wisconsin up to northern Wisconsin and even into the UP, I think. That's by firewood, you know, transport of firewood. So we have a bunch of dead wood down here. We have an influx of firewood material. I'm going to bring that up to my cabin, you know, to use for the summer or the fall, and that's how that pest is making these large jumps across our state and across the nation, and even in to Canada, neighbors to the north. So there's that. There are other types of pests or diseases where, and this is where I would recommend a certified arborist get involved with you know, removals of trees that have just died to determine what killed that tree, because there are pests or pathogens where the recommendation is to mulch up that wood residue and dispose of, say, in a landfill, to make sure that it's not available for use. One of the pests I could think about would be an Ips beetle, or what's another name for it? Yeah. So that would be if you have a pine tree that just up and died, and it's one tree out of a group of 10, and it just went crispy. There are a certified arborist. There are symptoms and signs that we can look for to identify, did that tree die from this particular pest? And if so, then that individual will remove the tree, but then take that mulch away, or take that wood residue away, so that pest doesn't spread. Can I answer your question?
Yeah, well, I've had discussions with some friends. I like to use the mulch that's down by the dog park at the end of Highway M. And then somebody was saying, well, aren't you just transporting disease? Because what they're chipping there is, you know, for a while, that's basically all they were throwing in there, were the chips from the emerald ash borer. And I thought, well, if you're using it like in your garden or your flower beds and stuff like that, what's the big deal? But I don't know. It's that small, like that pest in particular, you're not contributing to the problem because of its presence in the state. And that was where, when emerald ash borer was first detected, that our quarantines went county by county. And they were trying to manage it on the county level. And even that was impossible, you know, to do. It just continued its march, even with those quarantine measures in place. So within a city or a community, from one site to the next, you know, you're not doing any damage. It's doing enough damage on its own. You're not contributing to it. But again, it's not recommended to move that sort of material, you know, across state lines, or, you know, even, you know, half the state away, because you could be then exacerbating the issue or pushing it, further, faster along than it normally would.
So don't plant ash trees?
Yeah, don't plant ash trees.
Okay.
What trees do we not plant? A quick discussion on that. Ash aren't recommended, and it was interesting. After EAB, ash went on sale. These fire sales get rid of that stock. I don't recommend planting them. There are the questions that, do we have to treat forever, the trees that are being preserved? I think, I look to Dutch elm disease. So Dutch elm disease came established and killed, millions of trees in the 60s, 70s. We still have heritage elm trees here, that for whatever reason didn't get infected, and they're being treated now. And we still have naturally reoccurring, and I look at a lot of farm properties, as you're driving past the fence rows. There's a lot of elm trees in the fence rows. So there is this naturally occurring regeneration of elm, and then they get so big, to the point where then the disease is present. It's never gone away. They can grow up to a certain size and then they get infected and die. I think it's going to be a similar pattern with emerald ash borer, that we have those beetles, when they come into an area, they eat themselves out of house and home. And then they have to move on. That's how you get this spread. There's still that existing seed bank that will then regenerate and create new ash trees in an environment of reduced beetle numbers, because the environment couldn't support them anymore. But there will always be beetles around, and then they'll feed on those trees, and then the beetle population go back up, and it'll knock those trees down. But in the meantime, those trees grow up, reach the point of maturity, create a new seed bank, falls to the ground, those trees. And I think it's just going to be this cyclical thing. It'll never go away, but I think our treatment cycles will be able to extend. So right now, the best treatments are trunk injections that are good for 2 years. I think we're going to be, and there are some cities that are already testing, extending the treatment to a 3-year window. So it's the active ingredient is still in those trees, it's just at a lower level in that 3rd season. Well, if you have a reduced beetle population, you don't have as high of a threat of being infested or as many beetles attacking an individual tree, that you can extend those treatment cycles.
Do I remember the conversation right? If I had a John's a year ago in the fall, they told me there's a Japanese ash that is immune to the beetle.
Well, I can't speak to new ash that are available. Outside of, I've read some articles that there are, they're trying to propagate varieties that are immune or not as susceptible. Resistant. So same case with Dutch elm disease. We have a whole plethora of elm hybrid varieties that are regularly planted now, that are still susceptible, but not, some are more resistant than others. But they could still possibly succumb to it, but they're not as susceptible as our regular American elm. In the case there, yes, there are Asian ash species that evolved alongside that Asian beetle that do just fine, and it's that stock that I believe they're doing tests and trials on to create varieties that do well here that would be less susceptible. And it's the same concept that we have ash trees, we have our own ash, we have our native ash borer here in Wisconsin, but it's a pest host relationship that it found a balance. One can't outcompete the other, otherwise they wouldn't exist. Like we're dealing with right now with our native ash and our emerald ash borer, which is an Asian beetle. So our pests are just as destructive over there.
Black cherries here are good tree species. Over in Europe, incredibly invasive. Gray squirrels, good here, incredibly invasive over in Europe. It goes both ways, you know, kind of deal.
But with tree planting techniques, okay, fall, spring, I hear you're supposed to plant on those. What is,
Yeah.
or are there certain varieties that are better to be planted in a different
Yeah.
season?
Yeah, so question is, what are the good seasons to plant? Personally, my preference would be planting in the fall for a couple of reasons. Number one, you're getting the tree in the ground in a season that tends to be one of the more wet seasons here in the state. And then immediately following fall, we get winter, ground freeze. So essentially what you're doing, you're putting that tree in quote unquote storage for the winter in your landscape where it is set up, ready to go once spring happens. That it can come out of dormancy, it has moisture, it has nutrients, it's in the ground, it's ready to go for when we have our natural spring weather cycle. Spring is when a lot of planting gets done, and that spring is bare root, because that's the time that you can get bare root stock. But it is one of those where all of a sudden you have to alter your schedule to what Mother Nature is providing to get the trees in the ground during that time frame. Okay? Good time to get the trees in the ground. Trees can be planted in summer, but extra care needs to be taken with monitoring that plant health before it goes into the ground. So say by a contractor that has it in a yard, so taking care of it in the yard, the transport and making sure damage isn't done, not only from breaking trunks or limbs, but also the heat and the wind causing too much evaporation out of the leaves or transpiration out of the leaves. And then when it is in the ground, regular monitoring throughout the season, because the summer is our season of extreme heat and moisture variability. So a lot of monitoring happening for trees that are put in the ground during those summer months to make sure that they're getting everything they need. Just kind of, it's kind of like holding their hand or holding their branch through that difficult growing season. Make sure they get through that and then get through the appropriate dormancy into winter, and then they're ready to go for the next spring.
So a small tree is still good in the fall, even though it's going into the winter?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
I do all of my personal planting, I do it all in the fall.
Okay.
Because again, you can be, and if you know what you're looking for, you can find good deals on high quality tree stock in the fall. And then you have some more wiggle room to get them into the ground. I've planted trees in a snowstorm before. Kind of ran out of time on that one,
Yeah.
but that was the last planting of the season, and we had an early winter snowstorm. But yeah, you're just kind of putting it in temporary storage. Plant it right, get it set, get the mulch down and everything. Then the ground will freeze up. Hold that tree in place, and like I said, it is prepared to hit the ground running when spring occurs. All right, excellent question.
Couple more questions just off this slide.
Yeah.
When you put the mulch on and you don't want to mold over the mulch and so forth, do you put any fabric underneath it to prevent weed growth through the mulch?
Okay. So the question is, when mulching, are we putting any type of barrier, whether it be landscape fabric, down to discourage weed growth? I am not a proponent of the black landscape fabric because, from what I find, it is typically installed incorrectly, and by that I mean it's installed to actually overlap right up against, so your seams come right up against the tree trunk. That stuff does not degrade, and it will girdle the trunk of the tree. So that being said, there are things that you could do. You could put down cardboard or newspaper, materials that will degrade over time, over the soil, and then put your mulch on top of that. That will create a barrier that will prevent weed growth through that first season. And then at that point, it's just monitoring your mulch and picking a couple weeds as they come in the following seasons.
The second question off this also, that's only slightly off topic. In what cases do I want to put a slice of piece of perforated drain pipe and put that over the trunk of the tree to prevent rodent damage? Or in what cases do they wrap the tree with fabric to prevent sun damage in the wintertime?
Yeah, absolutely. So then the question is, in what cases do we install some sort of protective barrier on the trunk? Whether it's like a drain tile that's slipped down and fit around, or the white trunk wrapping, or a cage. Response is, it depends. And it's, so it depends on the situation, the site, and the tree, and it's never a set it and forget it, ever. So, my property, where I live and I manage my trees, we have such a high deer population that if I want to adequately protect the health of my trees, I need to install a fence 3 feet away from the canopy of the tree so that those deer can't reach over and nip at the ends of the branches. And that will also then keep the male deer, the bucks, from rubbing their antlers up against the trunk of the tree. If you have if you're a low deer population, and say you're in an interface that kind of deer might be moving through, I'd say there you could probably get away with just some light wire around the trunk or drain tile, around the trunk to prevent, again, a male deer from damaging the trunk of the tree. You really only need to put that on for about 4 months of the year, not even, 3 months. You want it on, I would say, mid-August through late December, and then pull it off. If you're doing something like the drain tile, that's a physical barrier, because it creates a dark, moist environment, or a moist environment that could promote fungal growth. You also want to prevent it from girdling, so you have to cut that and make it larger over time as the tree trunk grows. Once that tree trunk is about 8-inch diameter, you can get by without doing anything, because you really need a big deer that could cause damage. And then on the flip side of that, enough bark is established that even if a buck does come and do some damage, good chance the tree will be able to just seal off that wound and grow over it. The wrap, the white wrapping. That white wrapping is to prevent a condition called sun scald. Sun scald is a result of our late winter environment where we have increasing sun hours in the day and increasing intensity of sun rays, but still frigid cold temperatures. So typically it'll be on the south-facing trunk aspect where the sun's beating down all day, and then the other side is in shade. At night everything freezes. During the day, if it gets intense enough, this side of the tree can thaw, or patches can thaw. That freezing, thawing can kill patches of trunk or the bark and the cambial layer, creating a wound that looks like a buck rub, but it occurs in those late winter months in like February, March. So again, seasonally dependent. Put it on before winter. Take it off in the spring.
Are some species more vulnerable to
Your thinner bark species. So I would look at basswood and lindens, or those in the Tilia genus. Some of our maples, most maples, acer, in their younger years are pretty thin bark species. Beech, Yeah. I think those would be more susceptible, but then if you have species that has more of a thick, scaly bark, less susceptible, like your oaks, or hackberry, or Kentucky coffee tree, those that have some more protection through their bark systems. Fruit trees would be susceptible as well. Okay, so we'll kind of blow through some of the aftercare here so we can get outside and plant a tree. Pruning in the early years is that it can serve multiple purposes, whether it's benefiting the health of the tree or the safe use of a site. Here on the left, we're looking at pruning to promote fruit production. Here on the right is a case, of low branches that are prohibiting safe use of the sidewalk. The difference is here is we're training the tree over time to have a higher canopy, creating adequate clearance both for sight of people on the sidewalk and the safe, enjoyable use of the sidewalk without getting these branches in your face. Fruit, on the other hand, we're doing a lot of cuts that, as an arborist, makes me kind of cringe because we're promoting stress, where we're creating these heading cuts where I want a nice, tall, stately tree with equal branch spacing, good points of branch attachment. When I have a fruit tree, I'm lopping the heads off of those lateral branches, and I'm promoting the branches that are then going out and down. We want this drooping, rounded form because it's easier to pick the apples from a tree that's less than 10 feet tall and spreading versus an apple tree that goes straight up to 20, 30 feet. In doing so, we are cutting the life expectancy of that tree. So if you look at orchards, the commercial orchards, have turnover of these trees 15, 20 years, and then they're planting new trees. Whereas property where I live, we're still enjoying the apples occasionally from these very old trees that are at this point 60 years old. But I can't get to half of them because they're out of our reach, and they also tend to be smaller and not as producing as those young, intensively managed trees are. I tend to focus on safety, so I want to promote a strong central leader. It's much easier to do that when trees are young with simple hand tools than when trees are old. I'm making cuts now to promote strong central leaders and reduce codominant or competing stems so that I avoid these massive failures in the future. We know with these codominant stem, this is a bad structure with bad union. You can see here this darkened area is decay, and these are bad points of attachment. That these are trees that are more likely to fail in severe storm events. You can also prune to improve health. So on the left, we have a very crowded canopy with many competing laterals. Though this is a honey locust, so this prefers that deep current spreading form. So we're never really going to try to get a strong central, but we can create a more well-balanced, thinner canopy that during the growing season, light and wind can penetrate better. Wind can pass through more easily, reducing dynamic loading. And the penetration of sunlight will dry out that interior canopy more quickly after storm events. We don't want a dark, damp environment in our canopies because that promotes fungal growth on our leaves. So, natural pruning techniques. Here we're talking about the ABCs of pruning. A, we're promoting apical dominance. Apical dominance, strong central leader. We're removing B, bad branches. And we're reducing C, competing lateral branches. So, apical dominance, we want strong central leaders. Some tree species, such as this is both the same species of tree, autumn blaze maple,
prefer a deep currant or a shrub-like tree form. At time of installation, we need to make some aggressive cuts to reduce the size of these competing laterals or remove them altogether. And the lateral branches, we can see cuts where these branches were coming straight up into the canopy. Those were also removed. If we do nothing, we can have what's the case here on the left. Stems that are of equal size, at a poor point of attachment or a poor union, this is most likely to fail in even moderate storm events.
But you don't paint the cuts with any pine tar or anything.
So the question is, do we use any paint on our pruning wounds? We do not, and it is not recommended to use pruning paint on wounds, except for when you must prune oaks and elms during the growing season. The only time that you would be pruning oaks or elms during the growing season would be to correct storm damage or reduce hazards. And even then I would recommend, say if I had a broken branch on an oak tree, to cut it to a large stub. Cut the branch, instead of bringing the branch all the way back to the trunk, leave it as a stub. Immediately paint that. That's like talking about an arborist having a can of paint on their tool belt, making the cut and paint immediately. Then come back in the winter and make better cuts. Then create a better wound during the dormant season. Any other tree species, you don't need pruning paint for. And it's always preferred that any type of oak and elm pruning is done in the dormant season. Bad branches, we're going to remove dead, dying, disease, damage. Damage like this that creates these sharp, jagged edges, those are difficult. And that's like this tree here has a couple wounds like that. They're difficult to seal off. A tree can't heal itself, but it can grow over whatever's damaging to it. So if we can make nice, even cuts here, creates a wound that the tree can cover easily. Dying branches or disease, again, that's where getting an arborist involved that understands what they're looking at. The leaves on this tree, they have some holes, but that's just a natural occurring type of spot, not something I'm overly concerned about. And reducing competing laterals. This is somewhat of a lost cause, but something that you could try to do something with. I would recommend you just start over. But again, we want equally spaced lateral branches in a well-distributed canopy that's going to benefit the overall form and structure. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 laterals within the same union area. I would probably remove 3, reduce 3, and leave 3, and then it would be a multiple step pruning process over 3 to 6 years to finally get this tree on a better path. Maintain your focus. These young trees really don't want to remove more than a third of the canopy at any time. With brand new planted trees, make a couple of cuts, but then kind of leave it at that. You don't want to remove maybe a quarter to a third. Pile up your branches next to the tree as you're cutting and step back and compare what does your pile of branches look like to the existing tree canopy to kind of avoid over pruning. Pruning is wounding. Trees cannot heal themselves. They have to seal over these cuts. So be reasonable in the cuts that you're making. Avoid these large heading cuts that create wounds that are very difficult for the tree to seal over. Our proper cuts, we're going to be cutting just outside the branch bark ridge. So we'll typically see a ridge between the trunk and a branch, and then swelling. This is the collar. We make our cut just outside that. If we have a dead branch, we can see this swelling of tissue here. We make our cut outside of that point. Here's some visual representation.
This would be on a species like an ash. Here's or an oak, or here's our ridge, here's our collar, here's our cut. Fruit trees tend to be thin barked. You might only see some swelling. So we have swelling of tissue right here. Here's our cut. Good cut technique, 3 cuts. If we're removing larger branches, so we come in from the underside, then we come in from the top side. That creates this snap here, or the stub here. What this is doing is it prevents this tissue from tearing down into the trunk. That creates an irregular wound that's difficult to seal off. Once we have a stub that we can hold on to with one hand, take our saw, make our final cut. I talked about reducing laterals and how do we do that. If I have a stem that's growing straight up through the canopy, I'll come down to a lateral. We'll take this angle that this makes, a 90-degree angle, using the branch bark ridge to create one leg of create our A, go 90 degrees, creates X. My final cut will be dividing that by 2, creating C, so we have a sloped cut. This isn't necessarily to avoid the accumulation of snow in the winter or ice. It's just that this is a tree's natural response growth when we're making these types of cuts, these reduction cuts. If we cut a shelf here, what we would notice after a couple years is that the swelling of tissue is at this 45-degree angle. Now we would have this edge that the tree would have to grow up and over to actually seal off. I know we're flying through this a little bit, I'm concerned about time. Some mistakes that we can avoid are flush cuts. We don't want to cut branches straight up and down with a tree trunk. We want to make sure we cut outside at angles. We also have a nip from a chainsaw, so using the appropriate tools that we can control. Here is tearing. So this branch was too large to try to remove as one, or the 3-cut technique wasn't used. This is the result of having too much weight being removed at once, created this tear. So if we do our 3-cut and under and over and snap it off, that prevents this tearing. And irregular stubs were left here. More material could have been pruned off without damaging the trunk to create a wound that's easy to seal over. Response growth that we want to see would be a nice ring. A ring like this on the right around our pruning wound. This tells us that we removed only the branch material and now the stem is growing over that site. Flush cuts, when we cut into the trunk material without realizing it, we get these elongate response growth where we don't have response growth at the top or the bottom, so we cut into the trunk at that point. Pruning equipment, it's worth it to invest in some quality gear, not picking up any blue light special equipment, because this will stand the test of time. I have tried, buying the bargain hand saws, hand pruners. They're just not sturdy, they don't last. It'll create more fatigue on your body, and you'll have to buy more of those versus spending a little bit more, get some professional grade, which you can find at your landscape centers pretty easily. And that is our planting and really care PowerPoint. We're going to be heading into the field, but before we do that, do we have any questions?